Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast, where we challenge conventional wisdom and venture into the unexplored edges of ideas. In today's episode, we unravel the paradoxical role of error and imperfection in fueling genuine innovation, cultural resilience, and human authenticity. Rather than seeing mistakes as flaws to eradicate, we'll consider them as catalysts for creativity and meaning-making. Prepare to question the allure of flawless algorithms and to imagine a more fertile, if messy, landscape of complexity. Stay tuned. In the age of algorithmic hyper-optimization, the human imperative to cultivate meaning from uncertainty has never been more urgent. Once errors were mere blips, edges of the map where the ink ran thin and monsters lurked. Now, as machine learning systems gloss over anomalies and scramble to align every outcome with a predicted ideal, we risk losing far more than a few pleasant surprises. We risk losing the very conditions under which the spark of human complexity ignites. It's as though we have declared war on the unknown, determined to pave over every rough patch of terrain with neural networked asphalt. Yet the more we flatten reality, the less friction we have to generate forward momentum. Without friction, there is no heat, no transformation, and ultimately no meaningful progress. To understand the stakes, we must push beyond familiar intellectual territory and venture into the wilderness of complexity and emergence. Error in this expanded frame is not a sin to be expunged, but a necessary precondition for evolution, biological, cultural, cognitive. Complexity theorists like Ilya Prigogine have argued that systems achieve new levels of order through order out of chaos, where perturbations, rather than stable equilibria, yield emergent properties and novel structures. In complex adaptive systems, noise is signal and imperfection is data. Without these so-called errors, the system calcifies. Nothing new is born. Yet contemporary digital culture, shaped by the logics of efficiency and profit extraction, insists on a narrative of smoothness. Every commercial platform aims to eradicate uncertainty, assuring us that it can deliver precisely what we want before we know we want it. Errors are bad for business. Unpredictability confounds the conversion funnel. Consider the bland uniformity of recommendation engines that have pruned away our intellectual underbrush, guiding us only along well-trod paths. The result is the aesthetic equivalent of monoculture, overly tilled intellectual soil that no longer yields unpredictable wildflowers of thought. We become cultural consumers in a curated garden that tolerates no weeds, no strange mutations, no unruly growth. While this promise of a frictionless existence appears comforting, it may be robbing us of the conditions that allow extraordinary possibilities to take root. How might we instead revalorize the generative power of errors and anomalies? We could start by examining the fragile spaces where unpredictability thrives. Anthropologists have documented secretive storytelling traditions in remote communities that function as anti-archives, deliberately introducing narrative distortions to keep collective memory fluid. These communities understand that rigid perfection is a brittle shell. Cultural resilience emerges from the pliability of stories that can adapt to shifting conditions. Within these anti-archives, forgetting and misremembering are not failures, but acts of creative editing, forms of cultural resilience. Mistakes open conceptual wormholes through which new interpretations flow. Instead of a fortress of permanence, knowledge becomes a porous shelter, vulnerable to infiltration by fresh perspectives. In some corners of the digital world, a quiet resistance has already begun. Consider subversive communities of digital bricoleurs and net art provocateurs who celebrate the glitch. They recognize that errors in code, corrupted data, and scrambled signal transmissions are not defects but generative aesthetic materials. The glitch reveals the frame, exposing the architectures of control hidden beneath the interface. By embracing digital distortion, these artists reject the hegemonic promise of a perfect user experience and rediscover the raw materiality of the medium. They remind us that true innovation often arises not from seamless performance, but from breakdowns and ruptures that force us to reimagine what is possible. Such reimagination could extend into our approaches to technology design. Instead of striving to create hermetically sealed predictive engines, we might experiment with systems that deliberately incorporate error modules, algorithms that inject random noise or contradictory data points at critical junctures. Imagine a recommendation system that periodically offers a suggestion wildly at odds with your past behavior, a search engine that occasionally returns a deliberately obfuscated or contextually strange result. Not as a glitch to be fixed, but as a designed feature to reinstate serendipity and encourage intellectual wanderlust. Instead of striving for absolute control, designers could engineer platforms to embrace uncertainty, reframing error as a productive tension that expands our imaginative capacities. Critics may argue that such deliberate disorder risks confusion or even chaos, but confusion itself can be a catalyst for deeper engagement. Consider the pedagogical power of uncertainty in advanced education. A challenging text full of ambiguities forces the reader to work harder, fostering critical thinking and interpretive skill. Similarly, a technology ecosystem that never perplexes or challenges us will leave our minds atrophied, starved of the complexity needed to sustain intellectual life. It's no coincidence that breakthroughs in science often come from puzzling anomalies that researchers struggle to explain. The relentless logic of perfection starves us of the conceptual nutrients on which discovery feeds. To appreciate how crucial this conceptual sustenance is, we can turn to fields that thrive on complexity. In theoretical biology, errors in genetic transcription, mutations, are the drivers of evolutionary novelty. Without them, life would stagnate. Similarly, in ecology, diverse and unpredictable environmental factors prevent monocultures from dominating, allowing ecosystems to remain resilient. We find parallel patterns in cultural evolution. Hybrid languages, Creole cuisines, and syncretic religious practices arise when boundaries blur and mistakes in translation, adaptation, or interpretation accumulate over generations. Each error nudges the system in a new direction, expanding the palette of possibilities. Yet, as digital capitalism marches forward, it seeks to enclose this complexity within pristine enclosures. Data mining firms build models that aim to predict every whim of the consumer, flattening identity into a series of behavioral probabilities. If the past decade was about extracting value from personal data, the coming era might see an even more insidious development. Attempts to engineer the psyche to produce fewer anomalies, fewer deviations from the norm. With advances in brain-machine interfaces and emotion-detecting wearables, what if corporations learn to preempt not just our desires, but our capacity for surprise or dissent? In such a scenario, the struggle to preserve error becomes nothing less than a battle for human autonomy, for the right to remain unpredictable, to think thoughts no one has modelled. This battle will not be fought in laboratories alone. The reintegration of error into our cultural, technological, and social environments demands a reassessment of the ethical frameworks that guide innovation. It may require new forms of digital activism, proxies that inject misinformation not as malicious sabotage, but as a deliberate strategy to ensure interpretive multivocality. It might necessitate ephemeral archives that vanish after a set period, refusing the lure of permanent indexing. Such archives would reintroduce memory as something alive and contested, refusing the corporate push for total retention that solidifies our identities into data commodities. In economic thought, too, we can find precedent for a creative embrace of the unknown. Certain heterodox economists argue that recessions and market crashes, far from being anomalies to be scrubbed out by predictive modelling, are moments when new modes of production can emerge. These crises, painful as they are, can produce fresh economic subjectivities and experimental forms of exchange. Similarly, cultural collapses can generate artistic renaissances. Destruction, while terrifying, is often the germ of reinvention. By attempting to engineer risk out of every domain, we deny ourselves the possibility of these transformative births. We must also acknowledge that the celebration of error is not a simplistic call to sabotage knowledge or abandon rigor. Rather, it's an invitation to rediscover nuance. Anomalies are meaningful only when coupled with critical reflection. We need environments, intellectual, technological, cultural, that recognize complexity without devolving into pure chaos. The goal is a delicate dance to create systems open enough to let strangeness in, yet structured enough to make sense of that strangeness without crushing it into conformity. This balancing act could define the next wave of design and policy thinking. Envision educational curricula that train students to navigate uncertainty as a skill, encouraging them to find patterns in noise rather than fleeing to pre-validated answers. Consider AI ethics guidelines that require models to surface their anomalies, highlighting areas of low confidence or contradictory inferences. Such transparency could foster human-machine relationships built on dialogue rather than domination. Instead of surrendering our agency to silent, optimized models, we engage them as partners in navigating complexity, a partnership that acknowledges both human fallibility and machine limitations. The philosophical shift required is profound. We must move from a worldview that sees perfection as the highest good to one that values the dynamic interplay between order and disruption. Error becomes a form of negative space in the painting of understanding. Without those empty or dissonant patches, we see no depth, no dimensionality. The terror that errors inspire in heavily administered systems stems from a refusal to accept that all knowledge is incomplete, all memory partial, and all identities fluid. This perspective invites us to think about imperfection as a moral stance, a commitment to keep possibilities open. It asks us to resist the gravitational pull of certainty, to linger in the interstices where conflicting interpretations meet. In these unsettled zones, meaning is not delivered fully formed but must be coaxed into being, negotiated among multiple perspectives. It's a vision of culture as a living conversation rather than a final verdict. In practical terms, this might mean building platforms where users can flag useful confusion instead of error reports, prompting algorithms to explore new classifications. It might mean designing narratives, documentaries, journalism, literature that intentionally leave loose ends, challenging the audience to participate in meaning-making. It might mean embedding within political discourse the principle that robust debate thrives on complexity and that policies too perfect on paper can crumble upon contact with reality. Without the ability to handle anomalies, our body politic becomes brittle, prone to shattering when confronted by the unexpected. We have reached an inflection point, continue down the path of error eradication, and we risk creating a world so sanitized that no new ideas can germinate. Turn toward complexity, and we must accept discomfort, confusion, and vulnerability, not as failures, but as fertile soil. The challenge ahead lies not in imposing a single master narrative, but in cultivating multiple narrative threads that sometimes clash and contradict, granting us the freedom to navigate among them. As we leave behind the old myth that progress means ironing out every wrinkle, we step into an era where the wrinkles themselves form the contour lines of an unexplored landscape. In that landscape, error is not just a flaw, it's a compass pointing to hidden depths. Embracing this compass can guide us through intellectual wildernesses we have yet to chart, ensuring that rather than becoming prisoners of our perfected illusions, we remain free citizens of an imperfect, evolving world. And so, as we find ourselves perched at the intersection of chaos and order, we're invited to embrace the distortions and anomalies that enrich our understanding of the world. Rather than striving for a utopian perfection devoid of tension, we can learn to navigate the harmonies and dissonances that define a truly dynamic existence. In opening ourselves to complexity and uncertainty, we grant permission for new insights, resilience, and authenticity to emerge. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast. We hope it's inspired you to question the quest for flawless systems, to value nuanced conversation, and to treat error not as a threat, but as a subtle guiding force. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and remember that true depth lies beyond the boundaries of certainty.